What if a forgotten house on a lonely ridge held the key to saving an entire town? When Daniel Brooks, a struggling veteran, inherited an old home, he never expected danger to follow him. And he never imagined that his loyal dog Max would uncover the truth buried beneath its walls. Was this inheritance a burden or a blessing? And how far would a man go to protect a community that once feared him? Enjoy the story ahead. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The morning opened with a sky that carried a pale gray calm over the small town where Daniel Brooks lived. Thin clouds drifted slowly above the rooftops, and the air held the cool bite of early autumn. The streets were still quiet, and the light breeze brushed across empty sidewalks as if the day had not yet decided whether it wished to warm or remain cold. It was a simple stillness that could have soothed anyone except a man who no longer trusted calm mornings. Daniel Brooks was 40 years old and carried the kind of tired strength that came from years of service rather than peaceful labor. His face was lean, with hard angles, and a faint shadow of stubble that he shaved only when he remembered. His eyes were a deep brown, steady, but carrying a heaviness that never fully lifted. Those eyes had seen too much sand and too many sudden flashes of violence. His skin was sun-darkened from years of working outside as a mechanic since leaving the military. His hands were rough with small scars and oil stains that never seemed to wash away. Daniel was once a soldier who lived with purpose, but after returning from war, he slid quietly into the life of a working man who fixed engines for little pay and kept to himself. He carried the weight of memories that rose without warning, sometimes in the middle of a quiet afternoon, sometimes in the middle of sleep, when nightmares tore through the thin walls of his small home. His closest companion was Max, a German shepherd, about 5 years old, with a mix of black and tan fur and strong shoulders that made the dog look both protective and gentle. Max had sharp, intelligent eyes and the kind of calm patience that dogs sometimes possess when they have chosen someone as their responsibility. Max had been a rescue dog before meeting Daniel. The dog had been found near a wooded area as a young stray and brought to a shelter. Daniel met him during a volunteer day when he tried to reconnect with the world after leaving the service. Max walked directly to him and sat by his leg as if the choice had already been made. The bond between them grew silently and deeply. Max sensed when Daniel drifted into old memories and would press close to ground him. Daniel often said very little, but Max understood more than words could offer. On this particular morning, Daniel sat at a small kitchen table in his modest rented house. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee that had cooled too quickly. The room around him was sparse with a mismatched collection of furniture from thrift stores. Max lay at his feet, ears twitching each time Daniel shifted slightly. The man stared at a stack of bills beside his empty mug. His chest tightened each time he looked at them. His work at the repair shop was steady, but the pay was never enough. He lived month to month, sometimes week to week. It made him feel trapped, as if he had left one battlefield only to enter another. He lowered his head and rubbed the back of his neck. The ache there pulsed whenever he felt overwhelmed. He tried to breathe steadily, but the uneasy feeling remained. Max lifted his head and nudged Daniel gently with his nose. The dog sensed the tension without needing a reason. Daniel rested his hand on Max and let the slow, steady comfort remind him that he was not as alone as he sometimes felt. A sharp tap at the door made Max rise immediately. He stood alert but silent. Daniel pushed back from the table and walked to the door. His steps were slow and cautious. Sudden knocks still brought a spike of tension that traveled through his body before he could control it. When he opened the door, he saw the mailman, an older man with a soft, round face and gray hair tucked under a worn cap. The mailman offered a polite nod and handed Daniel a stack of envelopes. Among the usual mail, one envelope stood out. It was heavier and sealed with thick paper. Daniel frowned slightly and studied the return address. It came from a law office in a town he had never visited. The name of a lawyer he did not know was written neatly at the top. Daniel carried the mail back inside, while Max walked beside him, tail low but trusting. The envelope felt stiff in Daniel's hand. He slid his thumb under the flap and opened it carefully. Inside was a letter typed neatly on firm paper. He sat back down at the table and read slowly to make sure he understood each line. According to the letter, a woman named Ellen Parker had passed away. She was identified as the sister of his father. Daniel blinked at the name. His father had rarely spoken of family, and Daniel had never met anyone from that side of his bloodline. The letter continued, stating that Ellen Parker had named him the sole heir of a property located on Cedar Ridge. The property was described simply as a house and surrounding land. The lawyer invited him to visit the office for a formal reading of the will. Daniel sat back in his chair. He read the letter again. It felt unreal. Max nudged his arm again, and Daniel breathed slowly as he processed the words. The idea of inheritance did not feel like hope. It felt like a puzzle dropped into the middle of his worn-out life. He had never met this aunt. He did not know why she would choose him. He had no childhood memories of her, no old photos, no stories. His father had been distant and private, someone who grew quieter as the years passed. Now Daniel wondered what kind of woman Ellen Parker had been, and why she had chosen the nephew she had never met to inherit her home. He folded the letter and placed it on the table. He sat silent for a long moment before he whispered to himself in a low, tired voice. He wondered if this could be something good, or if it was simply another responsibility dropped into his worn hands. His life had rarely offered surprises that helped more than they hurt. The thought of a house on a ridge somewhere far away felt both strange and heavy. Max stepped closer and placed his head on Daniel's knee. The warmth of the dog's presence softened the tightness in Daniel's chest for a moment. He stroked Max slowly and let the rhythm ease some of the pressure in his mind. The sky outside brightened slightly as the morning continued. Daniel looked at the letter once more. He thought of the mechanic shop, the steady noise of engines, the exhaustion that followed every shift. He thought of the bills, the headaches, the nightmares. And now he thought of a house on Cedar Ridge that waited for someone who did not even know its previous owner. He felt unsure, but Max at his side made it feel a little less overwhelming. Whether he wanted it or not, the letter had changed something. Daniel took a slow breath as he looked toward the window. The day outside remained quiet. The world had placed a new path before him. And though he did not yet understand what waited at the end of that path, he knew he would have to follow it. With Max beside him, he felt ready to take the first step. The afternoon sky, above Cedar Ridge, carried a soft, pale light that hovered quietly over the winding roads leading into the hill town. Thin mist drifted across the treetops, and the air felt cool and lightly scented with pine. As Daniel Brooks drove farther into the narrow streets with Max beside him, the quiet weather seemed to match the cautious uncertainty growing inside him. The truck engine hummed as Daniel guided it through the small town. His hands gripped the steering wheel with a firmness that came from habit rather than confidence. The long drive from home had left his body stiff and his mind weighed down by the thought of the house he had not yet seen. Max sat alert in the passenger seat, with his strong frame upright, ears shifting every time a new scent or sound reached him. The dog's brown and black coat reflected the dim light that filtered through the windshield. Max watched the passing scenery with a vigilance that came naturally to him, and a loyalty that always guided him toward Daniel. Cedar Ridge appeared old and worn, a town that had once been lively, but now seemed to exist in a quiet retreat from time. Several buildings along the road looked aged with faded paint and sagging porches. A few small shops stood scattered across the street, but their windows displayed more dust than goods. People walked slowly across sidewalks, their steps unhurried but cautious when they noticed Daniel's truck. He saw their faces through the glass and recognized a familiar look. Suspicion mixed with silent curiosity. A look he had seen during his early days, returning from service when people did not quite know what to make of him. His chest tightened with a small pulse of discomfort. He reminded himself that he had no connection to this town, and they owed him nothing. Still, the sensation of being judged settled heavily on him. Max shifted and glanced at Daniel, as if sensing the change in his breathing. Daniel reached over and rested his hand briefly on Max's neck. The warmth of the dog's fur steadied him for a moment. He followed the directions from the letter until the road curved upward toward Cedar Ridge Hill. The incline grew steeper and the trees thicker as he approached the property that once belonged to Ellen Parker. When the house finally appeared through the trees, Daniel slowed the truck to a crawl. At first glance, the structure seemed larger than he expected, standing tall on the hill as if it had been built with pride decades earlier. But time had stripped much of its strength. The paint on the siding had peeled to reveal gray wood beneath. The windows were clouded with dust and grime. Portions of the porch sagged heavily, as if one sharp wind could knock them loose. Daniel parked the truck near the front steps and stepped out slowly. The ground felt uneven under his boots, covered in a thin layer of dead leaves left from the last season. Max jumped down beside him, landing with a soft thump and immediately sniffing the air. The dog's ears perked forward and his body tensed as if the entire property spoke a language only he could hear. Daniel took a step toward the house. A mix of curiosity and unease settled in his chest. He tried to picture the woman who had lived here. He wondered whether she had been quiet or stern or gentle. He had nothing but her name and a letter from a lawyer to suggest she had given thought to a nephew she had never met. The idea weighed on him. It felt strange to inherit something from someone who had been kept at such distance from his life. As he climbed the stairs, the wood creaked under his weight. The sound echoed faintly in the stillness and stirred memories of old military bases where each footstep carried more sound than expected. Max stayed close to him, his posture tall and watchful. The dog sniffed at the air near the porch railing, then let out a short, low bark toward a dark corner of the entrance. Daniel paused and narrowed his eyes. He saw nothing but shadow and dust. Yet Max continued to stare with alert intensity. Inside the house, the air felt heavy with the scent of age. Dust floated in thin threads across the dim light coming through the windows. Daniel looked around the wide living room with slow steps. The wooden floor beneath his boots felt soft in places as if moisture had seeped underneath through the years. The wallpaper on the walls had peeled back in large curling sheets, revealing the bare wood beneath. Furniture covered with old cloth sat undisturbed as if waiting for someone long gone. Max walked ahead and stopped at the far corner of the room. He gave a sharp bark toward a patch of darkness beneath a staircase. Daniel frowned and approached, crouching slightly to look closer. Nothing moved. There was no animal, no object to explain the dog's warning. Yet Max held his ground, shoulders stiff and tail slightly raised. Daniel felt a small chill touch the back of his neck. He trusted Max more than he trusted his own instincts sometimes. Years of PTSD had made his senses unreliable at moments, and he knew it. He stood and walked toward another doorway. The kitchen looked neglected, with counters lined with dust and cracked tiles beneath his feet. A faint scent of damp wood lingered in the room. Max followed closely, pausing every few steps to examine corners with slow, careful sniffs. The dog barked again, softer this time, but still alert. Daniel let out a breath and rubbed the back of his neck. The house felt wrong, but not dangerous. It felt abandoned, lonely, and forgotten. He moved from room to room, noting the leaking ceiling in one corner, the rotting floorboards near another doorway, the cracked glass of several windows. It became clear to him that the house would require a tremendous amount of work. Too much work. His fingers tightened slightly as he imagined the bills required to fix such a place. Thoughts of money returned to him like a weight settling across his shoulders. He needed cash to erase his debts. He needed stability. Selling the house seemed the most logical decision. He stopped in the hallway and looked out a window toward the slope of land that surrounded the property. The trees swayed slightly in a breeze, and the distant view of Cedar Ridge below stretched quietly. He could understand why someone long ago might have loved this place. But Daniel did not feel that love. He felt tired, worn, and uncertain how this house could ever become anything more than a burden. Still, something shifted in him as he walked through the final room. A sense of responsibility, perhaps, or maybe a quiet respect for a life he knew nothing about. He had not known Ellen Parker, but she had chosen him to hold the last piece of her world. That thought stayed with him more than he expected. Max barked again sharply at a shadowed corner. Daniel gave a faint sigh and approached the dog. The bark was not aggressive. It was warning, watchful, the kind of bark Max used when something did not feel right. Daniel rested a hand gently on the back of the dog's neck. Together, they stood in the dim light of the old house. Daniel felt the uncertainty rising in him again, but Max's steady presence helped him maintain control. He knew one thing, at least. Before he let this house go, he needed to understand it, and understand the town that watched him with suspicious eyes. He turned toward the doorway, with Max beside him, and stepped back into the fading afternoon light. The next steps would be slow and uncertain, but one thing was clear. Cedar Ridge would not welcome him easily. Night settled over Cedar Ridge with a heavy quiet that wrapped itself around the old house like a thick blanket. The air outside was still and cool, and the dim glow of the moon filtered through thin clouds that drifted across the sky. A faint breeze moved the branches near the windows, and shadows shifted softly across the walls inside. It was the kind of night that might have offered peace to someone else, but peace rarely visited Daniel Brooks in the hours after sunset. Daniel had spent most of the day clearing out broken furniture and sweeping layers of dust from the floors. His muscles ached with each movement, and his back felt stiff from bending and lifting. By the time darkness settled, he was exhausted, but exhaustion never guaranteed rest. He lay on an old mattress he had dragged into the least damaged bedroom. The room smelled of wood that had been left too long without care. Max rested on the floor beside him, curled in a protective position, with his head near the edge of the bed. For a short while, Daniel drifted lightly toward sleep, but the shift between waking and dreaming had become the most fragile doorway in his life. It took only one memory to tear through the thin veil of rest. One sound inside his mind echoed louder than the quiet house around him. Suddenly, he was no longer lying in the bedroom. His breath shortened and his body tensed. His heart pounded against his chest, like it did in the worst moments overseas. The darkness of the room changed shape in his mind and flickered into scenes of heat and dust and noise that had marked him long after the battles ended. His hands trembled, his jaw tightened. Daniel could not draw a full breath as the memory overtook him. His mind tried to pull him back to moments he had spent years trying to distance himself from. He felt as if the air thickened until it pressed on him from all sides. The walls of the bedroom felt too close. His pulse raced. He felt the familiar grip of panic rise, cold and relentless. Max rose immediately. The dog knew the signs long before Daniel spoke or moved. Max stepped close and pressed his head against Daniel's hand. His fur was warm and soft beneath Daniel's shaking fingers. The steady pressure of the dog's presence cut through the noise in Daniel's mind. He focused on the rhythmic sound of Max's breathing and the gentle weight of the dog leaning against him. It anchored him. Slowly, the panic loosened its hold. The bedroom returned to its quiet stillness. The images faded, and the air lightened again. Daniel rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand. Sweat dampened his forehead, and his breath still came unevenly, but the worst had passed. He whispered a few soft words to Max, though his voice was tired and strained. Max stayed close, sitting tall and unmoving until Daniel's heartbeat steadied. Eventually, Daniel lay back down, though he did not fall asleep again. He remained awake through most of the night, staring at the faint glow from the window and listening to the old house creak gently around him. When morning arrived, the gray light of dawn slipped through the curtains. Daniel felt heavy from the night, but he forced himself up. He moved through the house to distract his mind. The cool air inside helped him focus. Max followed him with slow, steady steps as they walked room by room, inspecting areas that had not been touched yet. Daniel reached the hallway near the stairs. Dust coated the floor, and the walls felt slightly damp from long neglect. Max suddenly stiffened. The dog turned sharply toward one section of the wall, near a wooden support beam. Max pressed his nose to the wall and sniffed repeatedly. His tail stood firm, and he let out a short, focused bark. Daniel paused and watched him. Max rarely barked without reason. He stepped closer. Daniel placed his hand on the wooden panel where Max was focused. The wood felt slightly hollow under his fingertips. He pressed again, firmer this time. A faint echo sounded from within the wall. Daniel frowned. He knocked lightly with his knuckles. The sound was different from the surrounding wall, almost empty. Max barked again, as if urging him on. Daniel felt a tightening in his chest, but not from panic this time. It was curiosity mixed with a cautious sense of discovery. He had no idea what might be behind the panel. The house had shown signs of age, but not of hidden features. Still, he trusted Max's instincts. Daniel left briefly to retrieve a small tool from the kitchen. When he returned, Max remained near the wall, watching him intently, with his ears pointed forward. Daniel wedged the tool gently into the seam of the wooden panel. The wood resisted at first, but then gave way. As he pulled it back, the old planks creaked sharply. Dust fell in thin streams to the floor. Behind the panel was darkness, but not empty space. It was an opening. Daniel widened the hole until he could step through. Max remained close behind him, but waited at the edge as Daniel moved into the hidden space. The room was small, with low walls and no windows. A thick layer of dust sat on every surface. The air felt untouched for many years. Daniel used his phone screen to cast a low glow across the room. The light revealed a wooden desk pushed into the far corner and several boxes stacked against the wall. Daniel approached the desk slowly. His breath caught slightly when he saw a few objects resting on top. There was an old leather-bound journal with pages yellowed by age. Beside it lay a folded map drawn by hand, delicate lines tracing shapes of land and water. He lifted the map carefully and studied the markings. The name Cedar Ridge appeared several times, along with small notes written in faint ink. The line circled a section of land behind the property where the ridge sloped downward. There were words written near one symbol. Daniel read them slowly. They described a water source, a hidden one. His pulse quickened. The journal contained entries written by his aunt. The handwriting was small and neat. Each line revealed glimpses of her concerns about the land and her fear of losing control of something valuable beneath the property. Daniel read only a few lines, but it was enough to understand that she believed Ridgestone had been watching the area closely. Her notes hinted at pressure and at secrecy. Daniel closed the journal gently and looked around the hidden room. He felt a strange mix of emotions rise within him. Surprise, unease, and something deeper that felt like the first piece of a puzzle settling into place. Max stepped into the room and sniffed at the floor. Daniel rested a hand on the dog's head. The discovery left him silent for a moment. He realized the house held more than age and dust. It held the traces of a woman he had never known, but who seemed to understand the value of the land she lived on. Someone who had tried to protect it. Someone who had left him clues without ever speaking to him directly. Daniel held the map in his hand and looked at the faint morning light slipping through the hallway. The house no longer felt just abandoned. It felt guarded. And Max, steady as always, had sensed it before he did. The morning light settled softly over Cedar Ridge, with a pale warmth that brushed across the old house and the quiet land surrounding it. The air carried a faint chill left from the night before, and thin beams of sun slipped through drifting clouds that hung over the trees. A calm breeze moved across the yard and gently stirred the leaves by the porch. It was a peaceful morning on the surface, though inside Daniel Brooks, the weight of something new pressed slowly against his thoughts. Daniel sat at the wooden table in the living room with the journal and the folded map he had found in the hidden room. Dust floated lightly through the sunbeams, and the air inside the house carried the dry scent of old paper and forgotten time. Max lay near Daniel's chair, with his ears alert and his body stretched comfortably across the floor. The dog watched Daniel closely, as if sensing the shift in his mood. Daniel opened the journal again and turned to the page he had skimmed the night before. The handwriting belonged to his Aunt Ellen. Each word was steady and deliberate, as if she had written not only for herself, but for someone who might find this long after she was gone. Daniel traced a finger along the lines as he read slowly. The entries described her concerns about the land beneath the house. She had written about changes she noticed in the soil during certain seasons. She had described the sound of water under the ridge and how the ground sometimes felt different after heavy rain. Her words explained how she had followed the clues over time until she discovered that the land sat above a natural underground water source. According to her notes, the source spread beneath the hill and extended toward the valley that fed the entire town of Cedar Ridge. Daniel sat back slightly. He felt a quiet unease forming inside him as he turned to the next section of her writing. His aunt had described a series of visits from representatives connected to a company named Ridgestone. She wrote that Ridgestone had pressured her multiple times to sell the land, offering money at first and then increasing their offers when she refused. Her tone in the journal shifted from cautious to wary as the entries continued. She noted that Ridgestone had grown persistent and that she suspected they knew more about the underground water source than they were willing to admit. Daniel took a slow breath and looked at the map again. His aunt had circled certain parts of the property and added notes in faded ink. One section included a series of arrows pointing to the area behind the house where the ridge dropped toward the valley. Beside the arrows, she had written a simple line: "If this source falls into the wrong hands, the valley will suffer." He felt his jaw tighten slightly. The reality of what the journal suggested began to settle into his mind. Ridgestone had not only wanted the land, they had wanted the water beneath it. If the company gained control of the source, they could redirect it or exploit it in ways that might drain the valley. Daniel remembered the quiet town he had driven through and the weary expressions of the people he had passed. He imagined what would happen if their water supply weakened. He imagined the consequences of losing something so vital. Max rose from the floor and stepped to Daniel's side. The dog rested his head gently against Daniel's leg. Daniel placed a hand on Max's neck and let the familiar warmth calm the rising tension in his chest. He had always been a man who carried responsibilities heavily. In the military, he had been someone who never ignored signs of danger. After returning home, he had tried to leave those instincts behind, but they never left him. They lived inside him like old scars. Daniel closed the journal carefully and set it aside. He rubbed the back of his neck and felt the muscles stiffen. He had not expected the house to contain anything more than old memories from a woman he had never known. Yet here he was, sitting in the middle of a place that held a secret tied to the survival of an entire town. The truth of it pulled at him slowly. He looked out the window. The line of trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the ridge fell away in the distance with a quiet dignity. He tried to imagine his aunt living here, a woman alone in a house like this, a woman facing pressure from a company that wanted her land, a woman who had chosen not to sell even when the easier path might have been to give in. Daniel felt a faint respect build inside him. He might not have known her, but he understood her instinct to protect something important. Max moved toward the hallway and gave a soft bark. Not the sharp warning of danger, but a quiet call for Daniel to follow. Daniel stood and walked alongside him. They moved through the house together, and stepped onto the porch. The morning breeze brushed across Daniel's face and cooled his thoughts. He looked toward the edge of the property where the land sloped downward. The map lines repeated in his mind as he imagined the underground source that lay hidden beneath the soil. He realized in that moment why the people in the town had looked at him the way they did. Their cautious eyes made sense now. To them, he was a stranger who had arrived to claim a house that had been at the center of an unresolved conflict. They did not know him. They did not know whether he planned to protect the land or sell it just as Ridgestone wanted. The thought unsettled him. He had been judged before, but this time the weight of it pressed deeper because of what the land meant. Daniel sat down on the porch step. Max settled beside him, with his body pressed close as if offering steady, silent support. The morning light grew brighter, and the wind carried a cool whisper through the trees. Daniel took a long breath. The path ahead was becoming clearer, though it was not one he had asked for. He understood now that Ridgestone's interest in the land was not harmless. He understood that his aunt had tried to keep the source safe for the sake of the valley. And he understood that someone had been watching him since the day he arrived, because they feared he might undo what his aunt had fought to protect. Daniel looked down at Max. The dog lifted his head and met Daniel's eyes with calm, steady focus. Daniel felt something settle inside him. Not resolve yet, but the beginning of it. The house was no longer just an inheritance. It was a responsibility he had stepped into without choosing. And now he knew what lay beneath the soil he stood on. He could not ignore it. He rose slowly and looked once more toward the ridgeline. The land seemed quiet, but the truth beneath it was not. He turned back toward the doorway of the house, with Max following just a step behind. The day ahead would not bring answers, but it had brought clarity. And clarity was enough to begin. Night fell over Cedar Ridge with a thick darkness that wrapped itself around the old house like a heavy coat. The air outside was cold and unmoving, and a low gray mist drifted through the trees on the ridge. A thin slice of moonlight pressed against the windows, but did little to brighten the quiet spaces inside. The silence felt deeper than usual, and the house carried a stillness that made Daniel Brooks tense without knowing why. He sat on the edge of his bed, in the dim room he had chosen for sleeping. The mattress was old, and the creaking floorboards beneath him shifted slightly each time he moved. Max lay near the doorway, with his head resting on his front paws. The German shepherd was relaxed in posture, but his ears twitched now and then, catching small sounds from outside. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck and tried to steady the restless thoughts that had followed him throughout the day. The journal of his aunt and the map of the underground water source had already weighed heavily on him. Now the night added another layer of unease. He had never been a man who trusted silence. Too many memories from the war hid inside quiet moments. He took a slow breath and lay back on the bed. Max lifted his head, but settled again when Daniel stayed still. The room held only the faint hum of distant wind and the old smell of the house. Daniel closed his eyes, hoping sleep would come quickly. Instead, he felt the hairs on his arms rise as a sound drifted through the hallway. It was faint, but sharp enough to break the stillness. A soft, metallic click. Then another. Max shot to his feet instantly. His body stiffened, and his ears pointed toward the back of the house. Daniel sat up, with his breath caught halfway in his chest. The sound came again. Metal scraping metal. someone outside trying to force something open. Max growled a deep warning that rumbled from his chest. Daniel stood slowly, trying not to make a sound. His breath felt tight as he listened. The clicking grew louder near the back door. It was the lock. Someone was working at it. Daniel felt a surge of cold fear run through him. He could not see the intruders yet, but he knew without doubt that this was no accident. This was no lost traveler or a neighbor wandering by. These were people who had come with intention. And that intention was tied to the land beneath his feet. Max barked once loud and sharp. The bark cut through the air like a warning shot. Daniel opened the bedroom door, and Max grabbed his pant leg, lightly pulling him away from the hallway. The dog wanted him to move, to follow, to escape. Daniel trusted him without question. They moved quickly through the dim hallway and down the steps toward the basement door. Behind them, the back door of the house cracked loudly as the lock finally gave way. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the hall. Heavy footsteps entered the kitchen. Daniel felt his pulse race. Max pushed against his leg, urging him forward. Daniel opened the basement door quietly and guided Max inside. The basement was cold and damp, with the scent of earth rising from the floor. He closed the door behind them, just as voices echoed through the kitchen above. The voices were low and rough, but Daniel could tell there were several men. Their steps were heavy and purposeful. They were searching the house. They were not here to scare him. They were here to force him into submission. Daniel crouched near the bottom of the stairs and listened. Max pressed close against him with his body warm and steady. The dog did not whine or bark now. He simply waited with focused tension. Daniel felt his breath come in short, shallow bursts. The night pressed hard against his chest. His mind raced back to moments overseas when danger came through doors in the dark. The old fear rose in him again, but Max leaned against him, grounding him in the present moment. They waited as footsteps moved from room to room. Objects were pushed aside. Furniture scraped across the floor upstairs. At least 2 men judging from the steps. Possibly more. Daniel clenched his jaw. They were tearing through the house looking for him, or for something they believed he had. When the intruders moved toward the front of the house, Max nudged Daniel toward the far wall. The basement had only one exit. The intruders did not find the basement door, or did not think to check it. At last the footsteps paused. A moment of stillness followed. Then the men spoke among themselves. Daniel listened, but the voices were too distant and muffled to understand. A few seconds later, the front door slammed. Their footsteps moved across the porch. Silence returned. Daniel waited several minutes before emerging from the basement with Max. His chest felt tight, and his hands trembled slightly. The living room showed signs of the break-in. A chair had been knocked over. A table was pushed aside. The back door hung crooked with splintered wood surrounding the broken lock. It was not a warning. It was a message. Daniel understood it clearly. The men who wanted this land were willing to go far beyond intimidation. They were ready to destroy whatever stood in their way. As Daniel stood in the damaged doorway, the weight of a single truth settled heavily inside him. He had a choice. He could sell the house and walk away from this trouble, or he could stay and protect the land his aunt had fought to preserve. Max stepped in front of him and looked up with steady, calm eyes. Daniel rested a hand on the dog's back. His thoughts twisted with uncertainty, fear, and responsibility. He did not know what the right path was yet, But the break-in had given him clarity. The danger was real, and the decision he made next would change everything. The morning over Cedar Ridge was pale and cool, with a thin layer of fog hugging the ground and drifting between the trees. The air held the scent of damp soil and the promise of coming rain. Light filtered softly through the clouds, giving the old house a quiet gray tone that matched Daniel Brooks' mood. The break-in from the night before still lingered in his mind like a bruise. Daniel stood in the hallway gripping the worn map he had found behind the hidden wall. Beside him, Max waited alert and focused. The German shepherd's ears flicked forward each time the house creaked, as if checking for danger. Daniel had slept little. His thoughts were heavy and restless. He kept replaying the moment the intruders forced open the door and the fear that had wrapped around him. Yet beneath the fear, something harder had grown. Determination. His aunt had tried to protect this land, and these documents were the only reason Ridgestone wanted to force him out. He would not make their job easy. He unfolded the map again. Lines and notes drawn by his aunt formed a path that led from the basement to the forest behind the house. A narrow tunnel, built decades ago for maintenance during an old water survey, was still marked clearly. Daniel looked at Max. "We follow it." The dog responded with a quiet huff and pressed closer. They made their way to the basement, where the air grew cooler and heavy with the scent of stone and earth. Daniel traced his hand along the wall until he found the faint outline shown on the map. He pushed against it, and the old panel shifted with a soft groan. Behind it lay a dark, narrow passage descending into the ground. Dust and cobwebs clung to its frame untouched for years. Daniel felt a brief tremor run through him. Confined spaces always stirred memories he wished he could forget. Nights overseas crouched in bunkers with shaking earth above him. The pressure of darkness pressing against his ribs. Max brushed his head against Daniel's leg, grounding him in the present moment. Daniel exhaled and entered the tunnel with Max close behind. The passage was damp and cold, with stone walls that swallowed sound. Only their footsteps echoed softly. The beam from Daniel's flashlight cut through the thick shadows, revealing rusted pipes running overhead and patches of moss along the walls. The air felt untouched by time. Daniel walked slowly, reading the hand-drawn markings on the map to guide him. His aunt had written distances and symbols with a careful, steady handwriting. A downward slope appeared ahead, and he recognized it from the map. The tunnel widened just slightly, and the ground leveled out. Max sniffed the air, then moved ahead, his tail low but confident. They reached a metal door, nearly hidden by years of dust. Its surface was tarnished and dull. A faded sticker near the lock showed digits that matched the numbers from the notes in the journal. Daniel knelt, examining the rusted hinges. The lock was old, but he managed to turn it with effort. The door released with a tired metallic sigh. Inside lay a small chamber carved into the ground like a forgotten storage vault. The smell of old paper and dried earth drifted out. Against the back wall sat a steel safe coated with dust. A red wax seal still clung to the top edge, though cracked and brittle. Daniel approached it slowly, feeling the gravity of the moment. This was something his aunt had sealed long before he ever knew her name. He brushed the dust from its surface. The keyhole was small and shallow. The safe was old, but well crafted. Daniel searched the nearby shelf and found a small metal box labeled with his aunt's initials. Inside was a simple brass key, slightly tarnished, but intact. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the key in the safe. The click echoed through the chamber like a forgotten memory being unlocked. Daniel lifted the heavy lid. Inside were folders carefully wrapped in cloth to protect them from moisture. He pulled the first one open. Pages filled with measurements, diagrams, and detailed notes about water flow beneath Cedar Ridge lay inside. She had tracked the underground springs with meticulous care. Each line of writing showed the depth of her worry for the land. More documents revealed chemical test results from streams on the ridge. Numbers marked in red circled repeatedly. Evidence of contamination, hydrocarbons, and heavy metals, all traced back to Ridgestone operations. Daniel felt his stomach twist. They had been dumping waste into the valley, quietly poisoning the very water they were trying to claim. Another envelope held receipts and copies of letters. His aunt had sent warnings to county officials, but none had answered. Ridgestone must have buried the complaints before they reached higher offices. A final set of letters caught Daniel's eye. They were written in a shaky hand from his aunt's final years. She wrote about Ridgestone men trespassing at night and threatening her. She wrote about locking everything away until the right person found it. The weight of her words settled deep in Daniel's chest. He closed the safe and sat quietly for a moment, trying to steady his breath. Max stepped closer, resting his head against Daniel's knee. The dog sensed his shift in mood and stayed completely still, offering silent comfort. Daniel looked down at Max, grateful for the steady presence beside him. These documents were proof. Not rumors, not suspicion, but undeniable evidence. Ridgestone had polluted the valley and planned to control the water by forcing families off the land. The break-in was not an act of fear. It was a step toward erasing anyone standing in their way. Daniel folded the documents, carefully placing them inside his pack. The tunnel felt colder now, but his resolve had grown stronger. He no longer questioned what he had to do. His aunt had trusted that someone would protect what she could not. Daniel rose to his feet, tightened the straps of his pack, and turned toward the long passage that led back to the house. Max walked beside him, calm, steady, and loyal. As they made their way through the tunnel, Daniel felt the fear of the night before fade into a quiet determination. He had proof now, and he knew that Ridgestone would not stop. But he also knew one thing with certainty. Neither would he. Morning came with a thin layer of mist curling over Cedar Ridge and drifting across the open fields. The sky was pale and washed with soft light as a weak breeze traced along the hillside carrying the scent of pine and cold earth. The air felt tense and expectant, as if the land itself sensed what was coming. Daniel Brooks stepped outside the old house with Max close at his side. Max stood tall for a German shepherd of his age, his coat a mix of tan and black with sharp alert eyes and a steady, loyal posture. Daniel felt the weight of the previous night still heavy inside him. The discovery in the tunnel had changed everything. He now understood why Ridgestone had followed him, and why his aunt had lived her last years in fear. He tightened the strap of the bag slung over his shoulder. Inside were the documents he had found. Proof that Ridgestone had polluted the valley and tried to take the land through coercion and silence. He knew they would not give up easily. The gravel on the driveway shifted. Daniel turned and saw a group of men walking toward the house. They were dressed in rugged outdoor jackets and heavy work boots. Their faces were stern and set with a cold purpose. The man in front was tall with a square jaw and trimmed beard, giving him a harsh and intimidating look. His expression showed no friendliness, only a firm intent to control the situation. Daniel felt a familiar surge of adrenaline tighten his muscles. The men stopped a few yards from him. The tall one spoke with a flat voice. "This property is being repossessed under order from Ridgestone. Move aside and let us carry out our work." Daniel kept his voice calm, though his pulse raced. "This land is not yours, and you have no right to be here." The tall man stepped forward. His eyes were sharp and impatient. "We were told you would be a problem. Do not make this harder." Max moved before Daniel could answer. The dog stepped in front of him, head lowered slightly, body stiff and protective. A low growl rumbled from Max's chest. The men hesitated at the sight of the dog. The tall man sneered, but his step faltered. Daniel placed a hand gently on Max, back feeling the strength beneath the fur. Fear rose inside him, but it was not the kind that made him freeze. It was the kind that made him choose. He could stay and risk losing everything, or he could take what he had and fight in a different way. He looked at the bag on his shoulder, then at the men blocking the yard. Daniel drew a deep breath and spoke quietly to Max. "Come on, boy." Max followed at once, staying close as Daniel backed away toward his truck. The men shouted after him, but they did not dare charge forward with Max guarding every step. Daniel climbed into the vehicle, started the engine, and pulled away from the house. His hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, but his resolve grew with every mile. He knew exactly where to go. The town hall stood in the center of Cedar Ridge, a low brick building with tall windows and a flag that fluttered gently in the cool breeze. Daniel parked and stepped out, tightening his grip on the bag. Max trotted beside him, his paws tapping the pavement in steady rhythm. Inside the lobby, a receptionist looked up with a startled expression. Daniel approached her calmly. "I need to speak to the authorities immediately. There are men attempting to seize my property, and I have evidence of major violations." She pointed him toward a small office where the local sheriff worked. Sheriff Collins was a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a solid build. His lined face suggested years of dealing with disputes, but also a patient nature. Daniel explained everything. He kept his voice steady, but every word carried the weight of weeks of pressure. He opened the bag and laid the documents out on the desk. Measurements, chemical reports, and letters from his aunt spread across the surface. Sheriff Collins studied each item with a deep frown. His brows knit together as he realized the scale of what Daniel held in his hands. "This is serious," he said slowly. "Very serious." Daniel nodded. "Ridgestone has been trying to take my land because they know what is underneath. They contaminated the valley and wanted to hide it." The sheriff exhaled heavily. "I will call state authorities. And you should go to the local news office immediately. This is not the kind of thing that stays quiet." Daniel left the sheriff office with Max at his heel. Their next stop was the small Cedar Ridge Chronicle building. A reporter named Linda Hayes greeted him. She was a woman in her late 30s, slim, with short brown hair and attentive eyes. She listened silently as Daniel laid out the documents and described what had happened at the house. Her expression hardened. "If this is true, you just uncovered the biggest environmental case this town has seen in decades." Daniel nodded. "I need people to know what they are doing." Linda photographed the documents and recorded his statements. She worked quickly, driven by the urgency of the story. When Daniel stepped outside again, Max bumped his leg gently, as if sensing the shift in Daniel's mood. Something inside him steadied. For the first time, he felt he was no longer standing alone against the storm. Within the hour, police cars headed toward Cedar Ridge Hill. Sirens echoed faintly across the landscape. Ridgestone men would not be able to hide behind threats much longer. Daniel looked down at Max, who stared back at him with unwavering trust. Daniel placed a hand on the dog's head, feeling a mix of exhaustion, relief, and determination. This was the beginning of the fight, but it was also the first moment he felt hope. Together, they headed toward the next steps, knowing that the truth was no longer buried in the dark. The morning sun rose gently over Cedar Ridge, casting a soft gold light across the hills. The air was cool and clean after a night of quiet rain, and the sky was clear, with only a few pale clouds drifting slowly toward the horizon. The peaceful weather made the land feel calm in a way Daniel Brooks had not felt in years. For the first time since arriving in this town, he woke without the weight of fear in his chest. He stood outside the old house and watched the light touch the roof and the surrounding trees. Max rested beside him, his fur warm from the early sun, his eyes bright with calm confidence. The news had spread quickly. Ridgestone was facing multiple lawsuits for environmental violation and unlawful coercion. Their project had been suspended while the investigation continued. Daniel remembered walking into the hearing with the documents, his hands trembling, while Max stayed by his side, steady as always. The officials had listened, read the papers, and examined every detail of the evidence. In the end, the truth was too clear to ignore. Daniel now stood as the legal owner of the house and the surrounding land. The ruling had lifted a weight he had carried without even realizing how heavy it was. The townspeople, who once watched him with caution, now greeted him with gratitude. Some apologized softly, saying they had not understood the danger his aunt had faced. Others thanked him for protecting the valley water and their homes. Daniel accepted their words quietly, feeling both humbled and overwhelmed. He was not used to being called a hero. He had spent too many years feeling broken rather than brave. Later that day, a small group from the town arrived at the house. They came with tools, paint wood, and warm smiles. Among them was a man named Joel Carter, a retired carpenter in his 60s with broad shoulders, gray hair, and hands rough from a lifetime of honest work. Joel was a quiet man with deep-set, kind eyes and a calm, steady voice. He told Daniel he had known his aunt and respected her strength. He wanted to help rebuild the place she had protected. Daniel felt a tightness rise in his throat at the thought. People were showing up for him in a way he had never expected. They repaired the broken windows, strengthened the porch, and replaced rotting boards along the siding. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air, but it was a welcoming sound full of life and renewal. Daniel worked beside them, carrying wood, lifting beams, painting walls, and clearing brush around the yard. Each movement steadied him. Each gesture reminded him that healing could be found in building something new. Max wandered among the workers, greeting each person with gentle nudges and soft tail wags. Children from the town laughed as Max circled around them, curious and friendly. Adults reached down to scratch behind his ears. Someone joked that Max was the true guardian of Cedar Ridge. By the end of the week, the house no longer looked abandoned. It stood tall again, still worn with age, but strong and welcoming. Daniel walked through the front doorway and paused. For the first time, he could see what this place could become. A quiet home, a place for rest, a place for men and women who had carried too many memories of conflict and loneliness. He knew what it felt like to return from war and feel lost in your own skin. He knew what it meant to feel invisible. He had felt that emptiness every night since leaving the service. But now he felt the stir of purpose returning. With the help of the community, he created a simple wooden sign: Cedar Ridge Veterans Home. The letters were carved carefully and painted in deep brown. Daniel mounted it on the porch, with Joel holding the board steady. When it was done, he stepped back and let out a slow breath. It was real now. A place for veterans to stay for a few days or weeks. A place where they could talk or sit in silence without judgment. A place to breathe. Daniel used part of the settlement money to buy simple furniture and repair the guest rooms. Some had fresh blankets. Others had rocking chairs or handmade shelves donated by townspeople. Volunteers came to help paint, repair fences, and plant flowers along the walkway. Max followed everyone, as if supervising their work. Daniel watched him greet an older veteran who had come by to look at the place. The man had weathered skin, a tired posture, and eyes that held old pain. Max walked up to him, gently placed his head against the man's hand, and stood still. The man smiled for the first time in a long while. Moments like that made Daniel feel something inside his chest shift gently. Max was more than a companion. He was a healer, a quiet guardian, a symbol of trust that people responded to with warmth. As weeks passed, more veterans arrived. Some stayed for a night. Some stayed for several days. They found peace in the quiet house, the open land, and the soft presence of a loyal dog who seemed to understand their unspoken fears. Daniel listened to their stories when they wanted to talk and sat beside them in silence when they did not. At night, the house glowed gently from the porch lights and the warm lamps inside. Daniel often sat on the steps with Max leaning against him. He would look across Cedar Ridge and feel something he had not felt in years: safety, belonging, hope. This house was no longer a burden left by someone he had never met. It was a beginning, a way to honor his aunt, his past, and every piece of himself that he once thought was broken. He rested a hand on Max, head feeling the steady breath of the loyal dog beside him. The future no longer felt like a weight. It felt like a path opening. Daniel whispered softly, "We did it, Max." The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the scent of pine across the hill as the sun set over Cedar Ridge and gave the land a quiet, peaceful glow. In the long journey of Daniel and Max from fear to peace, they showed that every person carrying old wounds can still find the light if they walk with patience and love. The house on Cedar Ridge, once a shadow of the past, became a living reminder of how community and kindness can shape a new beginning. People who were once strangers came together to rebuild the place, and through their unity, Daniel discovered the true meaning of living with purpose. It is not the pain that defines a person, but the strength they find when they rise again. In the quiet moments beside Max, Daniel understood that God places simple miracles in our path every day. A miracle may not arrive with thunder. Sometimes it appears as a helping hand or a loyal dog who refuses to leave your side in the darkest hours. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe to stay with us on the next journey. May God bless you, your family, and every step you take in the days ahead.